The Victorian era was a golden age for the occurrence of dark tales and supernatural phenomena, from sightings of monsters and ghosts to people being locked away and killed. In this video, we will explore all of this and more. We begin with a story about a number of young Victorian era girls who for some reason starved themselves to death. Fasting, or the deliberate abstention from food, has been practiced by most societies in certain contexts throughout human history. Some people fast for medical reasons, such as when tests need to be done and digestion will compromise the result, or when individuals undertake days of a juice or water diet to cleanse their system. However, typically fasting has been associated with religion. Muslims fast from dawn to sunset during Ramadan, and there are certain situations within faiths such as Buddhism and Hinduism where fasting is encouraged. So too with Christianity. Indeed, fasting and temperance were key parts of Christian life in the medieval and early modern periods. They have largely been abandoned today, but as recently as the 19th century, there were many people who claimed to be in closer commune with God through fasting. These were the fasting girls of Victorian society. In the second half of the 19th century, stories began to spread about mysterious girls who could survive for periods of weeks or even years without any food or water. In general, they first gained local renown in their communities in Britain, the United States and Canada, before often acquiring an international audience. Also, as their fame increased, people would travel from far and wide to see them, and pay money to do so. Journalists and other writers came to witness their bizarre abstinence themselves, and wrote about them, often puzzled as to how they managed to go so long without eating, and if the girls in question were in fact blessed with religious or magical powers. There were precedents to these kinds of abilities in the Middle Ages. For example, Catherine of Siena, a lay member of the Dominican religious order, gained renown in the late 15th century, in part for her extreme fasting, and had been deemed to be a holy woman. In a similar vein, the fasting girls of the Victorian era were soon believed to have religious or mystic powers, with some of those who came to see them believing that they were witnessing miracles. Yet, somewhat suspiciously, a few of the fasting girls or their parents would charge visitors for clairvoyant readings and other aspects of their supposedly mystical abilities. So, in order to get a better understanding of just what was involved, let's take a look at some of the foremost examples of fasting girls who gained renown and infamy during the 19th century. One of the more famed fasting girls in America was Mary Fancher, generally known as Molly Fancher. Her story is genuinely very strange. She was born in 1848 in Brooklyn, New York, but beginning in the mid-1860s, when she was a teenager, a series of unfortunate events occurred. First, she was thrown from a horse while riding in Prospect Park and struck her head against the pavement. Thereafter, she developed headaches and fatiguing spells. Then, a year later, she was dragged underneath a Fulton Street trolley car, which she fell under while stepping out of it. This injured her spine, and she was rendered quite ill by it. However, Fancher was still able to function in day-to-day life. This is until the 3rd of February 1866, a few months after the Fulton Street incident, when she had some sort of episode during which she seemingly became half-possessed and ended up writhing around on the floor of the Fancher family's kitchen. She was immediately carried to her bed, and she would remain there for the next 50 years. Fancher soon developed a reputation for both psychic powers and endless fasting. She was occasionally force-fed, but on other occasions, she allegedly went months on end without food. She was often in a trance-like state, and developed a reputation for being a clairvoyant when this occurred. Soon, the newspapers were referring to her as the Brooklyn Enigma. The great showman P.T. Barnum even tried to get her to join his show, but she refused. Some years later, her trances subsided, and she then developed 5 different personalities, called Idol, Sunbeam, Ruby, Pearl and Rosebud. Eventually though, in the course of the 1880s and 1890s, the press lost interest in her and she faded from public consciousness. It's entirely unclear to this day what happened. Was she faking all of this behaviour to earn money through her clairvoyant readings? Was she mentally disturbed? Was her fasting a sign of anorexia? In Fancher's case, it is really hard to tell. One of the most famous instances of a fasting person of the 19th century involved Anne More, although she wasn't a girl. More was in her 40s by the time she became famous in the autumn of 1808, after she'd been observed to not eat for 16 days and nights at her home in the village of Tutbury in Staffordshire in England. The purpose of the watch was to validate her claims, which had been ongoing for years by that point. Indeed, More's fame had spread throughout Britain and other countries, like the United States, and it was even believed that she had existed for 5 years without food at one point. Although not a fasting girl per se, More's story is consequential because she was an inspiration for some of those who later in the 19th century, like Fancher, began to conceive of their abstinence from nourishment as a religious gift. They would have been surprised to learn, perhaps, that More was a complete fraud. She had developed elaborate ways to smuggle food into her bedroom and consume it, even while being watched. It's believed that these were possible with the aid of her daughter, who would put a towel soaked with broth over her mouth and conveyed food from her mouth to her mother's while kissing her. Despite being a fraud, More gained a notable reputation thanks to her supposedly miraculous fasting, and consequently generated a lot of income. She died in 1813 at the age of 53, just months after being supervised by local writer and clergyman Leigh Richmond. Throughout the 19th century, there were many other fasting girls, and many of these proved fatal. One was Lenora Eaton, a girl from New Jersey from an upper middle class family. Her claims were put to a test in 1881, but a little over a month after the observers arrived, she died. Others still were revealed as frauds, just like Anne More decades earlier. For instance, 8 years after Eaton's death to the north in Quebec and Canada, Josephine Marie Bedard was discovered to have fabricated her claims. When observers came to her home, they saw food being smuggled to her, and in one instance, she even stole food from their own plates. As far as fraud goes, this wasn't the most sophisticated of operations. Finally, though she lived considerably later than the others, Therese Neumann, a German who was born in Bavaria in 1898, is often considered a late fasting girl. In 1918, she was partially paralysed after falling off a stool. This was just the first of many accidents and illnesses to befall Neumann, who claimed to be able to repeatedly heal herself. She also maintained that she'd abstained from eating and drinking from 1927 onwards, after she was visited allegedly by a saint, who told her she no longer needed food or drink. That year, Neumann was observed over the space of 2 weeks by a medical team, who wanted to test the veracity of her claims. They did not observe her eating or drinking during this time, though curiously, she had gained weight by the end of the 2 weeks. She died in September 1962, aged 64 from cardiac arrest. Despite the tragedy surrounding many of these fasting girls, undoubtedly, the most heartbreaking case of a fasting girl was Sarah Jacobs. Jacobs was a Welsh girl who was born in Carmarthenshire on the 12th of May 1857. She was from an impoverished family as her father, Evan Jacobs, was a poor subsistence farmer. One day, Sarah stopped eating and drinking, and word of this quickly spread around Wales. Eventually, the news of her alleged fasting reached the media, and a medical team of nurses was sent to the Jacobs' house to observe Sarah. However, where it seems likely that in the case of Neumann and some of the other fasting girls, that food and drink was somehow being secretly given to them, even during these observation periods, in the case of Sarah Jacobs, her parents Evan and Hannah Jacobs seem to have actually decided to not feed her during the period of observation. Sadly, she died during the observation as she had genuinely foregone food and drink for over a week. The lack of water was what caused her death, as she probably could have survived the observation period without food. She was just 12 years old when she passed, and was said to have gone without food for a total of 113 weeks. During the autopsy, evidence was found that she had a water bottle in her bed, but had been unable to open it while being observed. For their part in the attempted ruse, her parents were tried and convicted of manslaughter, though oddly, no charges were brought against the medical team who actually observed her dying in front of them. All of this begs the question, just what was the real explanation for the fasting girls and their actions? As we can see in the case of Anne Moore and Josephine Marie Bedard, fraud was often the goal. As the fame of the fasting girls and women spread in the 19th century, money could be made from people paying entry to the house of the fasting girl or selling stories to newspapers. Thus, there was an incentive to simply make up the whole thing. Many people believed these were religious interventions, and that certain fasting girls were in commune either with God or some demons. It should be remembered here that the spiritualist movement, which placed emphasis on religious miracles and other elements of almost magical belief, was at its peak in the mid-19th century. It would be easy to dismiss this as ridiculous superstition today, but in the case of someone like Molly Fanshawe, it must have been difficult to explain it any other way. This, after all, was a young woman who stayed under the scrutiny of the media for years in a trance-like state, and in total spent 50 years confined to her home, often producing psychic revelations and clairvoyant readings. It must have seemed to many people that the Brooklyn Enigma genuinely was experiencing some religious intervention. However, the most logical explanation in some instances is probably the most likely, and it seems that for many of the fasting girls, the problem was their own mental health. Most scholars have now come to the conclusion that the phenomena of the fasting girls was at least partially caused by a type of 19th century anorexia nervosa, an eating disorder whereby individuals will abstain from eating as a result of having a poor body image and a wholly excessive fear of gaining weight. Typically speaking, people believe that anorexia is a condition which emerged in the late 20th century in response to pressure being placed on young women to be thin. However, from the perspective of the fasting girls, it is significant to note that the term anorexia nervosa first came into use in 1873, when Sir William Gall, an English physician, first studied it systematically and gave the condition its name. Thus, right around the time that the fasting girls were coming to public attention, the condition of anorexia was first becoming a sufficient enough problem within Britain that physicians were beginning to study it. What is plausible is that fasting girls like Sarah Jacobs and Lenora Eaton were possibly anorexic, and this was the initial cause of their reputation for surviving without eating. Later though, this would have tragic consequences in their cases. Consequently, beyond the myths and rumours of religious communication with the celestial through their fasting, or figures like Fanshawe and Jacobs having magical powers, some of the fasting girls were most likely what they appeared to be, examples of the first infamous cases of anorexia in modern society. For our next story, we head back to a small city in France, where one woman was locked away by her family for over 25 years. Blanche Monnier was born on the 1st of March 1849 in the town of Poitiers in Vienne in western France. The Monnier were a well-established bourgeois family of the town, ones with minor aristocratic pretensions, in a time when France's nobility was experiencing a revitalization following the fierce republicanism of the late 18th century. Blanche's father was Émile Monnier, the head of the arts faculty in the local university, while her mother, Louise Monnier, was a well-known French socialite. Émile Monnier was also an individual who had earned a prestigious Committee of Good Works award. This was a merit which was granted in 19th century France to individuals who were perceived to have made significant contributions to their communities and to be possessed of high virtue. Moreover, the family had connections to high society in Paris. Thus, Blanche Monnier was born into a family which, to all outward appearances, were upstanding members of the community in Poitiers. Yet her story would prove that they were anything but. Blanche's early years were largely unremarkable. She went to school, moved in the society circles of Poitiers, and often visited Paris, which was just 4 hours away. As she entered her adult years, she developed into a striking beauty, with curly hair, fair skin and big, bright eyes. But a dreadful fate awaited her. In the mid-1870s, as she was entering her mid-20s, Blanche met and fell in love with a young man from Poitiers. Although he was a lawyer, a profession typically known for high salaries, the man came from a humble background and had few clients in the confined society of the provincial town. Moreover, he was substantially older than Blanche. As such, while he would make a perfectly adequate living, Blanche's parents were unimpressed with him as a potential marriage match for their daughter. Instead, they imagined her marrying into the minor nobility of Western France, or such were her good looks, even forming a union with a member of Paris's high society as the country entered the Belle Epoque. Blanche, however, remained smitten with her older suitor, and it was her reluctance to abandon the relationship which led to her acquiring a fame of a kind which no person would rightfully wish for. Her unwillingness to end the relationship with what her mother termed the penniless lawyer led her parents, with the aid of Blanche's brother Marcel, to lock her in a small room in their large house in Poitiers on the 1st of March 1875, which happened to be Blanche's 26th birthday. Confined to this small chamber, the Monniers told their daughter that they would only release her once she agreed to end the relationship and give up any thoughts of marrying her lawyer suitor. The matter might have ended shortly after this, but for some reason, which is not entirely clear, it didn't. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Blanche remained imprisoned in a small room in her parents' house in Poitiers. In time, for reasons which to this day are still not 100% clear, it turned into a permanent imprisonment. As we will see shortly, this was a ghastly confinement. One might wonder at this point how Blanche could have disappeared without anyone raising any suspicions or seeking to determine where she had gone. In response, it might be said that there were many individuals who did inquire after her well-being in the weeks and months that followed after she first disappeared in the spring of 1875. Neighbours were concerned, as were her friends, and Blanche's loyal lover tried to ascertain her whereabouts. But in time, the inquiry ceased. Nobody would have thought that one of the most respected families in Poitiers had imprisoned a family member in a room and simply decided to leave her jailed there indefinitely. Moreover, if anybody did bring her disappearance to the attention of the authorities, they evidently dismissed the reports. Perhaps people simply believed Blanche had headed for the sunnier climes of Paris. As the years went by, Blanche continued to remain imprisoned in her parents' home in Poitiers. While it seems relatively clear that Blanche's mother was primarily responsible for the awful circumstances in which she had placed her daughter, it is quite evident that other family members were also involved, though her father Émile's role came to an end when he died in 1879, 4 years after Blanche had been locked inside the room. Thereafter, it was primarily Louise Monnier and her son, Blanche's brother Marcel, who were engaged in keeping Blanche under lock and key. Her imprisonment was brutal. The room she was confined to year after year was an attic room. It had a small window, though this had been blacked out, and there was no natural light of any kind there. The door was kept locked from the outside, and Blanche was wholly reliant on whatever her captors provided for her own survival. The true extent of the horrendous conditions would be revealed in due course. Meanwhile, as the years passed, the original reasons for imprisoning the young woman disappeared. The lawyer whom she had been courting, and whose relationship with her had been the apparent reason for her detention by her family, died in 1885, nearly a decade after she was first imprisoned. Why her mother and brother continued to keep her in this torturous situation thereafter remains a mystery. Perhaps they believed that if they released her, she would report them to the authorities, and this was a risk they were not willing to take, especially as they were a recognised family in Poitiers. Nevertheless, it continued year after year. After a certain point, the residents of their locality in Poitiers must have largely forgotten about her, and her former friends and acquaintances too. That said, there were occasional incidents which people noted as being strange many years later. For instance, in the 1900s, a neighbour recounted an episode in 1892 when she believed that she heard a woman shouting from the Monnier house. At the time, she had dismissed it, but later, when it was revealed exactly what had occurred there, it all made much more sense. Evidently, someone had gotten wind of what was happening, and over 25 years after Blanche was first imprisoned, some anonymous hero came to her rescue. On the 23rd of May 1901, an Attorney General of the City of Paris received an unsigned letter which related Blanche Monnier's predicament in the following manner. Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honour to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth. In the light of reports of Blanche's condition in the days that followed, it is evident that, whoever this anonymous informant was, they had witnessed firsthand the conditions which persisted in the room she was imprisoned in, but the identity of her saviour remains unknown to this day. The Parisian and Poitevin police moved quickly on foot of this disturbing report. Within days, they entered the Monnier household and began searching it from top to bottom. For some time they found nothing out of the ordinary as they traversed the lower floors, but after a period, they came to a door that was padlocked from the outside. The police wasted no time, and instead of delaying until the Monniers produced a key, they broke down the door. What they entered was a scene of horror. The smell was the first thing they noticed, a noxious putrid odour produced by decades of filth that had not been removed by Blanche's captors. However, it was only when they removed the curtains, heavy with dust, from over the small window, and then broke off the heavy shuttering which had prevented any light from coming through for 26 years, that they realised the full extent of the evil which had occurred here. Blanche was lying completely naked in a room which was full of filth. Fragments of rotting food lay around the room. The air was putrid, and there were bugs running around the place. Blanche was absolutely terrified by the intrusion of these strangers into her prison after over a quarter of a century of confinement there. Unfortunately, her mind was completely gone, and she weighed just over 25 kilos, or approximately 4 stone. The police report afterwards gave a full account of what they encountered. We immediately gave the order to open the casement window. This was done with great difficulty, for the old dark-coloured curtains fell down in a heavy shower of dust. To open the shutters, it was necessary to remove them from their right hinges. As soon as light entered the room, we noticed in the back, lying on a bed, her head and body covered by a repulsively filthy blanket, a woman identified as Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier. The unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed of a sort of crust made from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish, and rotten bread. We also saw oyster shells and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The air was so unbreathable. The odour given off by the room was so rank that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. In the hours that followed, the police and medical authorities removed Blanche from this room of horrors. Her mother and brother were both immediately arrested. As word spread, a crowd gathered outside the house and remained there for days on end, calling for the head of Louise and Marcel Monnier. Unfortunately, no justice was to come. Blanche's elderly mother died of a heart attack days later, escaping the punishment she so richly deserved. Then it transpired that Marcel Monnier was largely psychologically incapacitated himself, and while he was originally sentenced to 15 months in prison, he was subsequently acquitted and set free. After the trial, Marcel sold all the assets of his mother's estate and retired to Cibourg, a commune in the southwest of the country. He also had a country house in central France, where he eventually died in June 1913. Blanche never recovered, though there was some limited progress and at least some medical staff were able to afford her some humane care in the years that followed. She was 52 years of age at the time that she was rescued and would live for a further 12 years. These were spent at a psychiatric hospital in the town of Blois in central France. However, she was plagued by several psychological disorders, notably anorexia and schizophrenia. Her imprisonment had also impacted on her in many other ways. For instance, she had developed an extreme aversion to strong light as a result of being denied sunlight for over a quarter of a century. Blanche died on the 13th of October 1913. She was 64 years of age and had spent nearly her entire adult life either imprisoned or confined to a psychiatric hospital as a result of the mental scars of her earlier confinement. Her story was widely reported on in the early 1900s in France, but it was also retold and became known to a new generation in 1930 when the French author André Gide, a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947, wrote about it in his novel La Séquestrée de Poitiers, meaning The Confined Woman of Poitiers. This was a semi-fictionalized version of Blanche's story in which Gide changed the main protagonists' names, but little else. Gide's account subsequently influenced Michel Foucault when he came to writing Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, one of his most significant works. As such, Blanche Monnier's horrendous story has had a considerable afterlife in 20th century French literature. The Victorian era saw Britain become the first global industrial power, but also a dark and dirty place where supernatural tales were commonplace. One such tale was that of Spring-Heeled Jack, which was fittingly narrated by Mortis Media.
On a late autumn day in 1837, a girl by the name of Mary Stevens was making her way to work at Lavender Hill, a district in what was then the southwestern edges of London, and which just a few decades earlier had still been part of the countryside beyond the city. Stevens had just come from Battersea, where she had visited her parents. As she was making her way through Clapham Common between Battersea and Lavender Hill, a terrifying incident occurred, as a strange, almost demonic figure bounded out of an alleyway at her. The creature assaulted Stevens, tearing at her flesh with the claws he had instead of hands. Stevens later reported that the creature's touch was stone cold. She screamed when it attacked, and the figure was evidently startled enough by that it quickly released her and fled. This was apparently the first sighting of the entity, which would soon become known as Spring-Heeled Jack. By November of 1837, numerous further sightings had been made across London. They described a creature which was said to appear suddenly, often jumping inconceivably large distances in front of individuals or moving coaches on London's streets. Several coachmen reported having to suddenly try to stop the horses pulling their coaches as the creature appeared almost out of nowhere in front of them and then scrambled away just as quickly. Another witness claimed that the mysterious assailant had bound over a 9-foot-high wall while cackling maniacally. Within weeks, the reports of this strange entity were circulating widely across London, and many wondered just who, or what, had attacked Mary Stevens and several others. By the end of 1837, concern had grown to the extent that the Mayor of London, Sir John Cohen, published a letter in the newspaper The Times in the first days of 1838, trying to allay fears about the sightings. In it, the mayor reassures the citizens of London that this was in fact some individual dressing up and visiting many of the villages near London in 3 disguises: a ghost, a bear, and a devil. However, it was claimed that this was the result of some prank that was being played, most likely by a member of the British aristocracy, as they would have the fundings necessary to stage these elaborate hoaxes. A number of infamous sightings followed early in the year 1838. One of these occurred on the night of the 19th of February when 18-year-old Jane Alsop answered the door of her father's house in Old Ford in what is now the Tower Hamlets region of London. She later claimed that when she opened the door she found someone pretending to be a policeman wearing a large cloak. When she brought a candle out to get some light, she was attacked by the figure, who she claimed vomited blue and white flames from his mouth, and then tried to tear at her neck and arms with hands that were claw-like. After a few terrifying moments, the creature had scampered off across the fields. A police investigation followed, but it was inconclusive. One neighbor reported seeing a young man in a large cloak nearby around the time of the attack, but the only suspect was a local carpenter called Milbank, whose alibi was that he was so drunk on the evening in question that he couldn't remember where he had been or what he had been doing. Milbank had apparently claimed during one pub visit at the time that he was Spring-Heeled Jack, but police eventually concluded he was just a loud-mouthed drunk. Alsop's case may have been entirely invented in any event, as she was the only victim who claimed Jack had actually spoken to her before attacking her. Perhaps she was looking for attention. Dozens of attacks were reported in the weeks that followed from London and the surrounding region. For instance, on the last day of February 1838, Lucy Scales, who like Alsop was 18, was attacked in an alleyway in the Limehouse district of the city. She claimed Jack had breathed blue fire at her as well, and that the experience had left her hysterical. The police continued to investigate sightings like this, and a reward was offered for information. But by now, the first appearances were obviously inspiring amateur copycats, and it was becoming more difficult to disentangle actual sightings from mere rumor. The papers did not help matters, some carrying sensational stories about how people had died of fright after being assailed by Jack in the streets. By this time, the alleged characteristics of Spring-Heeled Jack had been largely established. His primary trait was said to be his agility, moving with some incredible swiftness, with an ability to leap distances of 10, 15, or even 20 feet. Some saw in this paranormal or supernatural powers, but others who continued to believe there must be a logical explanation for the phenomenon soon devised the idea that the mysterious figure had springs inserted into the heels of his shoes which propelled him upwards and allowed him to jump these large distances. Thus the name was born of Spring-Heeled Jack, which seems to have been widespread by the late spring of 1838. By the end of early summer of 1838, Spring-Heeled Jack was the talk of London and was featured regularly in the newspaper, penny dreadfuls, and even on the London stage. However, it was at the peak of his fame that reported sightings of Jack began to decline. By the end of 1838, the official reports of attacks by him had dried up in the capital, and what few instances there were of him allegedly appearing came from other parts of England, where news of the supernatural assailant was belatedly inspiring rural copycats. By 1839, the hysteria had largely subsided, and Jack became more of a literary figure than one whom people feared they may actually run into down in a London alleyway. In the course of 1840, he developed a kind of folklore persona, as a species of supernatural highwayman, one who was believed to attack solitary travellers on the roads out of London. Occasionally, an alleged attack was officially reported. Such was the case of a woman who was assaulted in Teignmouth in 1847, and police considered that Spring-Heeled Jack may have returned to terrorize the city's inhabitants 10 years after his first appearance. More distantly, the spectre of Spring-Heeled Jack was raised again in the early 1870s, when there were reported ghost sightings in quick succession at Peckham in southeast London and in Sussex. The last reports of people believing Spring-Heeled Jack had returned seem to have occurred in Liverpool in 1904, over 65 years after the first sighting of him in London. In seeking to understand the phenomenon of Spring-Heeled Jack, historians and cultural commentators alike have offered differing opinions and theories to explain the entire episode. Some have sought answers in the paranormal. For instance, many 20th century writers suggest Jack was an alien of some kind, while others have considered that Jack was some sort of half-man, half-monster, a cryptozoological entity not unlike Bigfoot or the Chupacabra. Occultists have also been keen to argue that Jack was an instance of a devil or some other demon-like creature revealing itself. In this theory, Spring-Heeled Jack was summoned by occultists or another proponent of dark magic and ran riot around Greater London before being recalled to the underworld in 1838. Others have still contended with any supernatural element which was involved with actually occurring in the minds of Jack's first alleged victims. This view holds that the first sighting of Jack by people like Mary Stevens were that of the result of people being drugged, inebriated, or mentally disturbed. In this theory, the first sighting or two were figments of people's imagination, and then those that followed were the result of hysteria or copycats. One theory which gained considerable traction at the time, and which was alluded to in the letter which the Mayor of London published in the Times in January of 1838, was that Spring-Heeled Jack was an elaborate ruse that was being orchestrated by some member of the nobility. This theory at the time held that some noble had lost a bet, and the payment was to fabricate the appearance of some supernatural being around London. And there is some credibility to this. A member of the British aristocracy would certainly have had sufficient money to finance an elaborate scam like this, as there was no shortage of high-stake betting tables around 19th century London where a wager of this nature may have been made. Indeed, so popular was the belief in this theory that there was a considerable discussion of who the noble in question may be. Most had settled on the idea that the Irish peer Henry de la Poer Beresford III, Marquess of Waterford, was responsible. Beresford was a young noble in his mid-20s at the time and had been in the newspapers regularly for fomenting public disturbances with a posse of drunken hangers-on that he kept as his entourage. For instance, in April 1837, they had arrived inebriated to Melton Mowbray, where they attacked a toll booth keeper and a police constable and covered them with red paint. Beresford was regularly in and out of court facing charges for the Melton Mowbray incident and other episodes of hooliganism in the mid to late 1830s. Consequently, many people at the time formed the view that he had financed somebody who knew how to breathe fire and dress up and had some sort of spring boot that gave him the additional look of someone who could bound and jump abnormal distances. It's not entirely implausible, but one which cannot be proven beyond reasonable doubt. However, the story of Spring-Heeled Jack might also be an instance of Occam's razor. The theory is that the simplest explanation for something is the most likely one. In this case, the most likely explanation is that a society which was prone to believing in legends about gothic monsters and the supernatural was primed to blow a folk tale which was developed in 1837 completely out of proportion. In the 19th century, tales of the supernatural and gothic horror abounded. There were regular reported sightings of ghosts and other entities in the city of London from the 1800s onwards. By the time Spring-Heeled Jack suddenly started appearing in London tales of the supernatural, Horror stories and that of monsters were being published and finding huge audiences across England in the shape of the penny dreadful, cheap pulp fiction publications. This was also the century of Edgar Allan Poe's Gothic horror tales, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and Bram Stoker's Dracula. In this environment, it's quite plausible that the story of Spring-Heeled Jack was based on some unexplainable, unusual occurrence in late 1837, and most of what followed thereafter was down to people letting their imagination get the best of them at a time when people were already primed to believe in the supernatural and characters straight out of penny dreadfuls. As William of Ockham noted, the most obvious explanation is the most likely one.
During the 19th century, millions of Britons migrated to the US looking for a better life. One such woman was Anne Trollope Lohman, but she would later gain a sinister reputation in New York for her dark actions. Anne Trollope was born on the 6th of May 1812 in the town of Painswick in Gloucestershire, in southwestern England. Her father John Trollope was a labourer, and the family were not affluent. As a result, Anne began working when she was barely a teenager as a maid in a butcher's household. This was an all too common fact of life in 19th century Britain, where children were sent to work in factories and other establishments from as young as 9 years of age. Anne also wed when she was young. At 16 years of age, she married Henry Somers, a tailor from Wiltshire. Yet before long, she realised that he was an alcoholic, and by that time, Anne was already pregnant with their first child, a girl who was born in 1830 and whom they named Caroline. By that time, their economic prospects were already dwindling in England, and in 1831, the young family set sail for the Americas, one of tens of millions of Europeans who did so during the 19th century. Anne's fortunes did not improve upon arrival in the United States. She and Henry settled on William Street in Lower Manhattan in New York City. But shortly afterwards in 1833, Henry died of typhoid fever. Thus, the young widow Somers found herself far from home, scrambling to make ends meet in New York City to support herself and her infant daughter. We would probably have never heard of Anne Trollope and her alter ego Madame Restell had it not been for her second marriage. This occurred in 1836 when Anne wed Charles Lohman, a 27-year-old well-educated printer who worked for the New York Herald. He had immigrated to America himself and was of German and Russian background. It was from her second husband that Anne began developing an interest in contraception and population control. Charles was a member of a circle of radical thinkers and philosophers in New York at the time, and one of their subjects of concern was the rapid expansion of the population of the United States and many European nations since the early 18th century. As a result of this interest, he had ended up publishing a number of papers on population issues in the 1830s. Anne soon began to develop an interest in contraception herself. She was encouraged in this by Charles, and additional know-how was provided by her brother Joseph, who had also immigrated to America and who was now working in a New York pharmacy. Soon, she had developed a contraceptive pill, one which included a mixture of ingredients such as pennyroyal, black draught, savin, ergot of rye, mallow and motherwort. These she ground up and made into pills and powders. Armed with these products, she and Charles concocted an elaborate backstory for her business, claiming that Anne had a grandmother in France, a Mrs. Restell, who had shown her the recipe for these contraceptive pills while she was visiting Europe training as a midwife. Thus, in the late 1830s, Anne began selling her female monthly pills under the name Madame Restell. At this time in the United States, abortion and contraception were both legal in almost every jurisdiction. Consequently, Anne was free to advertise her contraceptive or abortion pills legally in the New York papers. Her first notice, for instance, ran in the New York Sun in March 1839 and effectively informed women that if they had an unwanted pregnancy, she could offer a certain remedy to those who called to her office. This was on Greenwich Street, and it was here that many New York women began calling from 1839 onwards to obtain some of Madame Restell's female monthly pills and preventive powder, as they were soon being described as. Alternatively, individuals from out of town wrote to her, and the certain remedy was sent to them in the mail. Anne's early forays into contraceptive and abortion pills and powders relied on folk remedies and ingredients of dubious effectiveness. However, she soon expanded her services into contraceptive and abortive methods of a more precise nature. By 1840, Madame Restell was operating a boarding house and referring to herself as a female physician. Here, some women gave birth to unwanted children, whom Anne used her connections to find good adoptive homes for. But it was also clear that abortions, both by taking abortifacients and through surgical methods, were occurring here. This was not a violation of New York state law at the time, so long as the abortion was carried out before quickening, the point at which the pregnant woman could begin to feel the fetus move around, and after which it was deemed that the child constituted life. This usually occurs around 16 to 20 weeks into the pregnancy, or roughly 4 to 5 months in. Thus, Anne was only risking legal difficulty if abortion services were offered to women who had passed this point in their pregnancy. As early as 1840, Anne was in some legal difficulty, owing to the death of a woman called Maria Purdy, shortly after having an abortion performed at Madame Restell's boarding home. Purdy had confessed to having had the abortion to her husband on her deathbed, and he subsequently contacted the authorities. The press erupted with anger against Restell, calling her the monster in human shape, and accused her of carrying out acts against God. Legal charges were then brought against Anne, but she successfully defended herself in court. The following year, Mary Rogers, a noted beauty who worked in a New York tobacco store, was found dead in the Hudson River. One eyewitness swore that she was dumped after a failed abortion attempt, and this was quickly linked to Madame Restell, but nothing more came of this. Afterwards, rather than being dissuaded from her activities, Anne actually expanded her abortive and contraceptive work, opening offices in Philadelphia and Boston. The case of Madame Restell and the death of Maria Purdy had gained some notoriety in the New York papers in the early 1840s, and this combined with a growing movement against abortion saw a tightening of the laws in the years that followed. By 1845, abortion was largely prohibited in New York State. Moreover, the punishments for performing an abortion were increased considerably. Now, if an abortion was performed after the quickening, it was deemed to constitute second-degree manslaughter, and so could result in several years in prison. Anne's services increasingly moved underground in the mid-1840s as a result of these changes to New York state law, but she nevertheless continued her work as before. It should be noted here that Madame Restell was not entirely motivated by an ideological desire to allow women to have control over their own reproductive capacity, in the same way which many advocates of abortion rights in the US and the world are today. That was surely a factor in her work, but she was also highly motivated by money, and there is evidence to suggest on more than one occasion that she was willing to assist in an abortion which she had at first refused to facilitate when she was offered a much higher sum of money. This was exactly the scenario which led to her arrest and first imprisonment. In 1847, New York was captivated by the story of the arrest of Madame Restell once again. She had apparently facilitated an abortion for Maria Bodine. Bodine had become pregnant by her employer, a man who had offered to pay Restell an unusually large sum of money to have the pregnancy terminated after she at first refused. Evidently, the abortion was then carried out, but when Bodine subsequently fell ill, she pressed charges. Restell argued at trial that Bodine's illness was the result of her suffering from syphilis, rather than anything she had done. But the court and public opinion were firmly set against the woman who first started advertising her female monthly pills 8 years earlier. She was found guilty and was sentenced to 1 year at Blackwell's Island prison on what is now Roosevelt's Island in the East River. A 19th century prison was not a pleasant thing, and one would think that the experience of dwelling in one for a year would have dissuaded Madame Restell from continuing her abortive work in the aftermath of it. But this was not the case. Although she claimed that she would forgo any further surgical abortions, she continued to sell her pills and powders and commenced work again at her boarding house. Evidently, New York society and the government authorities fell for this ruse. In 1854, she applied for naturalized citizenship status, which she received, while around the same time, the mayor of New York City, Jacob A. Westervelt, attended and officiated at her daughter Caroline's wedding. Behind the public facade though, Restell and her husband continued to offer illegal abortion services. As these were now prohibited in an increasing number of states, customers travelled far and wide to obtain an abortion at the famed Madame Restell's offices. They paid handsomely too, with between $50 and $100 being a standard fee and upwards of $1,000 being charged for higher-end clients who wanted greater privacy. Yet, by the end of the 1850s, the trickery was up. The newspapers dubbed Madame Restell the wickedest woman in New York, and detailed the enormous wealth she and her husband had amassed as a result of their activities. For her part, Anne was content to fire back at these attacks on her through an ostentatious display of her affluence, appearing in public in the finest furs and wearing diamond jewellery. When travelling around the city, she used her own private carriage drawn by 4 horses and with her own liveried coachman. Most strikingly, she and Charles had a huge mansion built as their private home on the corner of 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. Over these years in the 1850s and 1860s, she earned hundreds of thousands of dollars, the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars in today's money when adjusted for inflation. Despite her flaunting of the law, Madame Restell was able to avoid any further legal jeopardy for many years to come. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 saw the abortion issue and the lobby surrounding it shelved for many years, and so Anne was able to go about her business largely unhindered. Yet, in the early 1870s, Madame Restell met her match in the shape of Anthony Comstock, an anti-vice activist who in 1873 set up the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. Comstock campaigned against everything, from abortion and prostitution to erotic material and gambling, and was determined to bring about the demise of Madame Restell. The same year that he established the Society for the Suppression of Vice, he also successfully petitioned to the US Congress to pass a series of laws criminalizing the sending of obscene, lewd or lascivious, immoral or indecent publications through the mail. This included things like contraceptives and abortifacients. The Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use quickly became known as the Comstock Laws, and it was this legislation which would bring about Madame Restell's fall. The Comstock Laws carried serious penalties. Even providing information to another person about where they could find abortive or contraceptive services could result in a fine of up to $2,000 and a 5-year jail term. Thus, Anne had to be more careful in her business dealings from 1873 onwards. But duplicity led to her downfall, by none other than the architect of the new laws. On a spring day in 1878, Anthony Comstock showed up at the door of Madame Restell's office, claiming to be a married man who needed some contraceptive pills for his wife. After she had assisted him, Comstock took the pills directly to a police station. The following day, police showed up and searched the premises, finding instruments which could plausibly have been used to carry out abortions. Thus, Madame Restell was arrested, charged, and then bailed. In the days that followed, articles began appearing in New York papers by Madame Restell and others arguing various sides of the case. It seemed as though it would make for an explosive trial on the morality or immorality of what Anne had been doing for decades in New York, but the trial never came. At 65 years of age, and facing the prospect of spending much of the remainder of her life in prison, the woman who had become the most famed abortionist in New York City over a period of 4 decades took her own life on the 1st of April, 1878. Her maid found her in her bathtub, having cut her own throat. 144 years later, the abortion issue is as decisive in the United States as it was in Madame Restell's day. Jack the Ripper was Victorian England's most notorious killer. For our final tale, we are looking into the life of his last victim, which was narrated by Briefcase.
Mary Jane Kelly was born around the year 1863 in the county of Limerick in Ireland, but when she was still a young girl, she moved to Wales with her family. Her father worked as an ironsmith and her mother tended the house, looking after their 8 children. Mary Jane's family was poor, and Mary Jane herself didn't get much of an education as she spent her days helping her mother, and at the age of 16 she was still unable to read and write. So with no real education and with no skills, her only hope of escaping her impoverished life was to get married to a man who had reasonable employment and would be able to provide her with the things that her parents were unable to. In 1879, Mary Jane met a coal miner named Davies. He was a hard-working man, and soon after meeting, they got married. Mary Jane was now able to have a better life, and like many married women in Victorian Britain, she stayed at home, cooking and cleaning and creating a homely atmosphere for her hard-working husband. Her life, however, suddenly changed when 3 years after she married, there was a fatal explosion in the coal mine, and one of the fatalities was her husband. Mary Jane was still a young woman, but she was also now a widow and on her own. She tried to find work and went to the Welsh capital, Cardiff, but illiterate and with no experience, she found it difficult to get a job. It was now the year 1884, and finding herself poor and homeless, Mary Jane took the decision to leave Wales and travel to London. She knew that there were many more work opportunities in London, but again she found finding employment difficult. So with very few job options, she became a prostitute and started to work in a West End brothel. This was a more high-end establishment, and the men that frequented it were usually very wealthy. One of her regular clients became very fond of her and invited her to accompany him to France. This was very exciting for Mary Jane, so she modified her name to the more French-sounding Marie Jeanette, and together they travelled like a regular couple to France. However, her idyllic trip with the wealthy young man didn't turn out as she had hoped, and during her time there, she was sold into prostitution and was the victim of human trafficking. Fortunately, she managed to escape and returned to London. Afraid that she might be found, she moved to London's East End, hoping that there she would be safer. She settled in the borough of Stepney, where at first she lived with a man named Morganstone, before leaving him for another man named Joe Fleming. Mary Jane was an attractive woman. She had dark hair and green eyes, and she was often courted by men. She was usually quite quiet, but if ever she had a few drinks, she changed and would start singing Irish songs. Her personality would change so much that she became argumentative and abusive. Because of this, she became known locally as Dark Mary. In April 1887, while on a night out, Mary Jane met a man named Joseph Barnett. They met again the next day and decided to live together. They seemed to get on well, and they moved into the Spitalfields area of London. Their new home was small and consisted of one tiny square room which had a bed, 3 chairs and a table. The area where they lived was well known for its poverty, crime and filth, and was part of the area known as the Wicked Quarter Mile, which was a street almost entirely occupied by lodging houses and pubs. At the time, Mary Jane wasn't working, so Joseph provided for both of them. He had a job as a fish porter at Billingsgate Fish Market. He was, however, known to be a difficult man who didn't get on with his employer, and they regularly fell out. Eventually, he was dismissed. Fortunately, he was known as a hard worker, so soon found another job as a meat market porter. This job, however, did not pay as much as a fish market, which meant he was not able to provide for both himself and Mary Jane. Unable to find a job herself, and now experiencing financial hardship, she reluctantly returned to prostitution. While at work, she met a girl named Julia, who had nowhere to stay, and knowing how hard life could be for young girls working on the streets, she invited her back to her tiny lodgings and told her she could live there. As grim as her lodgings were, the alternative was worse. Many people struggled to pay their rent, and with the unsolved Whitechapel murders committed by the unknown person who the press had dubbed Jack the Ripper, Mary Jane was concerned for her friend's safety. The room was so small that Joseph decided that he could no longer live there, so after an argument with Mary Jane, he left on the 30th of October. The couple, however, agreed to still see each other, and Joseph said he would come and visit regularly. Just over a week later, on the evening of November the 8th, 1888, Joseph came to see Mary Jane, and he was accompanied by a friend named Maria Harvey. The three went out and spent some time together before Joseph and Maria left at around 8 p.m. Joseph returned to his lodgings, and he stayed up late into the night playing cards with other residents before falling asleep around 12:30. The next day, a man named Thomas Bowyer was sent by Mary Jane's landlord, John McCarthy, to collect the rent, as she was 6 weeks behind on her payments. Bowyer arrived at the lodgings at Miller's Court at 10:45 in the morning, but after knocking on the door, he got no reply. He thought it strange that no one was in, so he moved a makeshift curtain to one side and looked through the window to see if anyone was there. What he saw shocked him. On the bed was a mutilated body of a lady, which he presumed must have been Mary Jane Kelly. A horrified Thomas Bowyer immediately reported what he had found to the police. The first police officer at the scene was the Inspector Walter Beck, and he was followed by many other officials. Soon Superintendents Thomas Arnold and Edmund Reed from Whitechapel's H Division arrived, as well as Frederick Aberline and Robert Anderson from Scotland Yard. Superintendent Arnold broke into the room at 1:30 p.m. Once inside, they started to look at the gruesome scene, and they soon discovered that the victim's clothes had been burnt, probably to light up the room, as the only source of light was a dimly lit candle. Then the doctors Thomas Bond and George Bagster Phillips arrived and were tasked with analysing the corpse. They concluded that the extensive mutilations must have taken around 2 hours to inflict, and that the time of death was between 2 and 8 in the morning on Friday, November the 9th, 1888. Dr. Phillips determined that the cause of death was a slash to the throat, and Dr. Bond stated that the killer had no medical knowledge. He wrote that in this case, the mutilation was inflicted by a person who had no scientific or anatomical knowledge. He said that in his opinion, the person who carried out the crime did not even possess the technical knowledge of a butcher or a horse slaughterer or a person accustomed to cut up dead animals. The police looked for witnesses. One of Mary Jane's neighbours, named Mary Ann Cox, reported that she had seen Mary Jane returning home at around 11:45 p.m. She stated that Mary Jane looked drunk and was with an overweight ginger-haired man wearing a bowler hat. After seeing one another, they wished each other good night, and Mary Jane went into her accommodation with the man. Mary Ann stated that Mary Jane began to sing Irish songs. She said she had to go out again at 1 a.m. and return to her residence at 3 a.m. According to her, there were no sounds or light coming from Mary Jane's room. Another witness named Elizabeth Prater, who lived above Mary Jane's lodgings, stated that at 1:30 in the morning, just as she was getting into bed, The singing had stopped. She said she woke up again at 4 due to a kitten walking over her neck. It was around this time that she heard a faint cry calling out murder. Another local resident named Sarah Lewis said she also heard the same thing, but neither of the witnesses investigated, as in the 1880s it was common to hear cries of murder in the East End of London. The neighbour Mary Ann Cox added, but she couldn't sleep that night, as she kept on hearing people coming and going from Miller's Court. She even heard someone leave around 5:40. This was very accurate, as Elizabeth Prater left the residence at 5:30 in order to get a drink at the 10 Bells public house. She told police that while she was going to the pub, she saw nothing suspicious. Due to a state the body was in, it was very difficult for the authorities to identify the victim. Joseph Barnett, her former partner, said that he recognised the body to be that of Mary Jane Kelly by the ear and the eyes. And John McCarthy, her landlord, also identified the body as Mary Jane's, saying he was certain that it was her. The death of the young 25-year-old was registered with the name Marie Jeanette Kelly. The police had no leads to find who committed this terrible crime, so on the 10th of November, the government issued a statement, hoping they would be able to find evidence on the killer. In the declaration they said that any accomplice that wasn't the person that had committed the crime would be pardoned if they bring forward information and evidence of the murderer or murderers. No one came forward. In the following days, the police completed extensive house-to-house inquiries and searches, but from this, no traces of the culprit were found. Following examination of the corpse, Mary Jane's body was released, and she was eventually buried on the 19th of November 1888 in the Roman Catholic cemetery at Leytonstone. At the funeral, none of her family members were in attendance. The police continued the investigation, and a new witness appeared. He was a labourer named George Hutchinson, who said he knew Mary Jane. He told the police that he saw her at around 2 in the morning, and that she had asked him for a loan, but he was broke so he couldn't help her. Following this, he states that she was approached by a man in the street, and after some talking, they headed back to her residence. Despite it being late at night and very dark out, he gave the police a detailed description of the man. George Hutchinson stated that the man was suspicious due to his strange appearance, as if he wasn't from the area. The police did, however, think that it was possible that this information provided by the new witness may have taken place on a different day, as it was some time after the murder that he actually came forward with the evidence. Despite the government offer, the importance of the case, and the huge police investigation that took place, no one was ever charged or tried for the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Throughout the years, various theories have emerged regarding the identity behind the person that took her life. The two authors, Paul Harrison and Bruce Paley, proposed that it was her former partner, Joseph Barnett, that killed her in a jealous rage. They also suggested that he committed the other famous Whitechapel murders with the aim of scaring Mary Jane so she would leave the life of prostitution. Others suggest that Joseph Barnett only killed Mary Jane, and the reason behind the mutilation was to throw the police off and make them believe that the murderer was Jack the Ripper. However, it is unlikely that he was responsible, as following the murder, his clothes were examined for bloodstains, and he was questioned for a total of 4 hours. Despite this, there was no evidence that linked him to the crime, so he was released without charge. Certain authors claim that the witness George Hutchinson was responsible for the murder, and was actually Jack the Ripper himself, trying to confuse the police, while others indicate that he was probably an attention seeker looking to sell a story to the papers. Other theories speculate that Mary Jane wasn't in actual fact one of Jack the Ripper's victims. The theory behind this is that the other victims were in their 40s, while Mary Jane was 25, therefore considerably younger. Further evidence that may prove this is that the mutilations found on her corpse were more extensive than those on the other victims, but some historians say this theory can be discredited by the fact that she was the only victim to be killed in private. Following the death of Mary Jane, there were no similar murders to those committed by Jack the Ripper for another 6 months. Most people consider Mary Jane Kelly to be Jack the Ripper's last victim, and it is assumed that the Ripper's actions ceased due to death, imprisonment, or emigration. However, many think that Mary Jane Kelly was not one of the Ripper's victims at all. To this day, the true identity behind Mary Jane Kelly's killer remain a mystery, just like Jack the Ripper.
Thank you everyone so much for watching this compilation video. I hope you found it interesting. If you want more compilation videos like this, let me know down in the comments. Or if you want more stories like those covered in this video of dark Victorian type tales, please also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.